Comstock Flank, Nevada, October 1872. The air, already thin at 6,000 feet, carried the first premonition of winter, a clean, sharp edge that promised hardship. On a small, wind-swept claim overlooking the canyon, men stopped to watch Colin Trevithick. What he was doing made no sense. He wasn't building a cabin. He was committing an act of profound foolishness. Instead of laying his foundation on solid ground, he was meticulously framing his floor joists directly over the gaping mouth of an abandoned prospect shaft. The 8-foot timbered collar of the old silver hunt became the centerpiece of his home. A dark, circular void, plunging into the silent geology of the mountain, sat where a hearth should have been. Aldous Pendergrast, the district claim recorder, pulled his horse to a halt, his face a mask of professional concern and personal disbelief. He was a man who understood the unforgiving logic of the mountains. He'd seen 100 cabins go up, and a dozen come down under the weight of a Comstock winter. "Trevithick," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "A sensible man seals that hole before winter. You're inviting the damp, the rot, and every bit of bad air from here to perdition. Your floor timbers will be pulp by spring." Colin Trevithick, a quiet man with the dense build of someone who worked with heavy timber, looked up from his ads. He nodded a slight acknowledgement. "The air is clean," he said, his Cornish accent clipping the words. Then he turned back to his work, sighting down the length of a joist. A mule skinner named Silas Croft, watching from the track below, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "It's madness," he declared to his companion. "Building a house on a hole. He's a Cornishman. Don't know any better." They watched for another minute as Trevithick carefully measured a space in the very center of the floor frame, then shook their heads and moved on, spreading the word about the madman on the flank. What did this Cornish bow carpenter, this immigrant who knew more about moving air 1,000 feet underground than he did about building on top of it, understand about the physics of convection that the hardened, practical men of the Nevada silver rush had missed entirely? The answer wasn't just in the timber and nails. It was in a lifetime spent in the dark, and in the brutal memory of a winter that had nearly broken his family. If you find this kind of historical problem-solving fascinating, consider subscribing to our channel. We dig into the lost knowledge of the past, and I promise by the end of this story, you will understand the elegant science behind Trevithick's supposed madness. Let us know in the comments, what's the most clever, low-tech solution you've ever seen for a common problem? Colin Trevithick was not a prospector. He had no fever for silver, no eye for the telltale glitter in a seam of quartz. He was not a rancher, with no knowledge of cattle or seasons of grass. He was a bow carpenter, a specialist from the hard rock tin mines of Redruth, Cornwall. His hands knew the heft of an axe shaping ventilation doors, the precise angle to set brattice cloth to split an air course, the resonant thud of a well-seated stall deep in the earth. His entire trade was the invisible architecture of air, coaxing life-giving drafts through miles of suffocating tunnels to keep men alive. He had spent 2 decades convincing air to go where it did not want to go, using nothing but temperature differentials and cunningly placed passages. He had brought his wife, Morwenna, and their 2 children, Jago and Carenza, to Nevada, not for wealth, but for the dry air his Cornish doctor had prescribed for his lungs, scarred by years of rock dust. They had arrived late the previous autumn, buying a cheap, hastily built shack that the seller swore was tight as a drum. That first winter was their crucible. It taught them a new kind of cold, a high desert cold that was active and predatory. It wasn't the damp chill of Cornwall. It was a dry, searing cold that found every crack and nail hole. The candle flames on their small table didn't flicker. They lay down, flattened by the constant, invisible rivers of frigid air pouring through the walls. Morwenna's precious axle grease, meant for the cart they depended on, gelled in its bucket into a paste so thick it had to be chipped out with a knife. In the mornings, the seams of the flour sacks were often frozen shut, the minimal moisture within them turned to ice crystals overnight. They burned through a winter's supply of piñon pine by January, the heat roaring up the chimney and doing little more than pulling more glacial air through the chinking. The children slept in their coats, their faces pinched with cold, their breath pluming in the dark. Colin, a man whose life's work was the control of air, felt like a failure. He had built nothing to protect his family. He had only built a sieve for the wind. The problem, as Colin came to understand it, wasn't just poor construction. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of heat itself. His neighbors, good and experienced men, all fought the same losing battle. They built their cabins the way they had been taught: a single wall of logs or rough-sawn planks, a stone hearth at one end, and a steeply pitched roof to shed the snow. They fought the cold with fire, and the fire was a demanding, inefficient master. The standard Comstock cabin was a thermal disaster. The massive stone fireplace, while a potent symbol of warmth, was a terribly inefficient machine. It consumed vast quantities of wood, with 90% of the heat generated escaping directly up the chimney flue. This powerful updraft created a negative pressure zone inside the cabin, turning the entire structure into a crude vacuum. Cold, dense, outside air was actively sucked in through every gap, around the window sashes, under the door, through the seams between the logs, where the chinking had cracked and fallen away. Their neighbors, the Schmidt family, a hard-working German couple with 3 small children, exemplified the struggle. Heinrich Schmidt spent nearly every daylight hour felling, splitting, and hauling wood. His cabin was perpetually filled with the smell of scorching pine and wood smoke. Yet a bucket of water placed 10 feet from the roaring fire would have a skin of ice on it by morning. They stuffed rags and dried moss into the cracks, but it was like trying to dam a river with handfuls of dirt. The cold didn't just seep in, it was inhaled by the house itself. The very act of making a fire summoned the cold, a cruel paradox of physics that drained their energy and resources. The more wood they burned, the fiercer the drafts became. They were trying to heat the entire state of Nevada, one armload of piñon at a time. Colin saw this and knew that fighting the cold head-on was a fool's errand. You could not defeat an enemy with infinite reserves. You had to find an ally. Colin began his project in late summer, choosing the abandoned prospect hole not for its convenience, but for its depth. He had spent a day lowering a weighted line into it, measuring it at just over 90 feet. It was perfect. He ignored the cleared, flat ground nearby and began setting his foundation stones directly around the timbered collar of the shaft. The work was slow and methodical. He used heavy 10-inch square timbers for his floor joists, not the 6-inch planks his neighbors used. He was building a bridge, not a floor. Aldous Pendergrast made his first visit then, clipboard in hand, to officially record the new construction. He was a man who believed in regulations and established practice. Trevithick, Pendergrast had said, his pen hovering over his ledger. The district code is informal, but it's based on hard experience. No man builds over a shaft. It's unstable ground. And the miasma, the bad air, it's a known danger. It causes lung fever and rot. Colin was fitting a joist into a notch he'd cut with surgical precision. He paused, looking at the dark opening, then at the claim recorder. The ground is stable, Mr. Pendergrast. The collar is sound, and the air has no smell. He offered no further defense. He simply returned to his work, tapping the massive beam into place with a commander beetle. Pendergrast sighed, making a note in his ledger. Owner advised of unconventional and potentially hazardous foundation. Proceeds at own risk. As the floor took shape, the strangeness of Colin's design became even more apparent. He laid his floorboards, thick 2-inch planks of sugar pine, but he did not lay them tight. He left a deliberate, uniform gap between each one, no wider than a penny. To any other builder, it looked like shoddy, amateurish work. It was a floor designed to leak. "You'll have wind coming up through there that'll freeze the marrow in your bones," commented Jebediah Stone, a carpenter who was framing a new saloon down in Virginia City. He'd come up the flank to see the Cornishman's folly for himself. "Every snake and rat in the territory will be paying you a visit." Colin just nodded. "The air doesn't come up there," he said quietly. The centerpiece was the grate. In the exact middle of the floor, directly over the center of the shaft, he left a square opening. Into this, he fitted a heavy iron grate, 14 inches to a side, its bars thick and widely spaced. It was the only object in the cabin he hadn't made himself. He had paid the blacksmith a silver dollar to forge it for him. It looked like a drain in the floor of a slaughterhouse. The walls went up next, but here too, Colin deviated from convention. He built 2 walls, an inner wall of 1-inch planks and an outer wall of the same, with a 4-inch air gap between them. He packed this gap loosely with dried marsh grass and sawdust from his own millings. It was a technique he'd seen used to insulate ice houses back in Cornwall. It was laborious, doubling the work and the amount of lumber needed for the cabin's shell. By the time the roof was on, his cabin was a local curiosity. Trevithick's sieve, some called it, a house with a hole in the floor and grass in the walls. Pendergrast made a final visit as the first snows began to dust the high peaks. He stood in the single room, the grate a dark eye in the floor, the gaps between the planks clearly visible. "I've logged this as a temporary dwelling, Colin," he said, his tone more weary than critical. "For your family's sake, I hope you see sense and seal that floor before the real cold comes. A man's pride is a poor blanket. It will be warm," Colin said. It was not a boast or a hope. It was a statement of fact from a man who understood the mechanics of his machine. To understand Colin Trevithick's cabin, you have to forget about the fire. The cabin's heat did not come from burning wood. It came from the mountain itself. The system was a silent, elegant engine, powered by one of the fundamental forces of nature: convection. The key was the 90-foot mine shaft. Below the frost line, which in Nevada might be 5 or 6 feet deep, the Earth maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round. It acts as a massive thermal battery, absorbing the sun's heat in the summer and releasing it slowly through the winter. At a depth of 90 feet, the rock and earth surrounding the shaft stayed at a constant 52 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the weather on the surface. That shaft was a column of 52-degree air, a reservoir of permanent, mild warmth. Physics dictates that warm air is less dense and therefore lighter than cold air. The air in the cabin on a winter day, even with a small fire in the cook stove, would be substantially colder and denser than the air at the bottom of the shaft. Colin's grate was not a drain. It was an outlet. The lighter, 52-degree air from the shaft would naturally rise, pushing upward through the grate into the cabin. It wasn't a forceful draft, but a slow, constant, and voluminous upwelling of temperate air. 1 cubic foot of 52-degree air contains approximately 1.2 British thermal units, or BTUs, of heat energy relative to a 0-degree baseline. A continuous flow of this air represented a significant and unending heat input into the living space. But this was only half of the engine. For the warm air to rise, the cold air had to go somewhere. This was the genius of the gapped floorboards. The coldest air in any room naturally sinks to the floor. In a conventional cabin, it pools there, creating icy drafts and freezing the floor itself. In Colin's cabin, this cold, dense air, heavier than the rising column from the shaft, would fall through the penny-wide gaps between the planks. It would cascade down into the mine shaft, displacing the warmer air and forcing it upward through the central grate. He had created a closed-loop convection circuit. Cold cabin air sinks into the shaft, is warmed by the surrounding earth, becomes less dense, rises through the grate, circulates through the room, gradually cools, becomes dense again, and sinks back through the floor gaps to repeat the cycle. It was a self-sustaining thermal siphon, a slow-motion, invisible water wheel of air. The double insulated walls were crucial to this process. They slowed the rate of heat loss to the outside, allowing the slow, steady input from the earth to accumulate, raising the ambient temperature of the room far above what the geothermal source alone could achieve. Colin hadn't built a sieve. He had built a lung for his house, and its slow, steady breath was the warmth of the deep earth. That winter, the mountain showed its teeth. It came not as a blizzard of snow, but as a siege of ice and fog. For 7 consecutive days, a rare weather phenomenon gripped the Comstock. A dense, supercooled fog, known as a pogonip, rolled in, blanketing everything from the valley floor to the mid-slopes. The sun vanished. The world was reduced to a gray, silent twilight, and the temperature plunged to 18 degrees below zero and stayed there. Rime ice, thick as a man's finger, grew on every surface. It coated telegraph wires until they sagged and snapped. It sealed window sashes shut with a crystalline crust. It turned every nailhead into a white, fuzzy bloom of frost. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a battle for survival. The Schmidt family's cabin became a small pocket of misery. They kept their stove burning cherry red day and night, but the super-chilled air, dense and heavy, pressed in from all sides. The interior walls were coated in a layer of frost that crunched to the touch. Their youngest daughter, Anna, developed a deep, rattling cough. Mrs. Schmidt spent her days boiling water on the stove, not for tea or coffee, but just to introduce some humidity into the desiccated, frigid air. They hung blankets over the door and windows, but the cold crept through them, relentless and invasive. Inside the Trevithick cabin, a different reality unfolded. The small cook stove was lit for a few hours in the morning and evening, for meals, and to boil water. For the rest of the day, it sat cold. Yet the air inside the single room was calm and still. The temperature hovered in the high 50s, warm enough for the children to sit on the floor reading a book without shivering. This was the proof of Colin's design. The domestic warmth was found in the small details. Morwenna was able to knead dough on the wooden table, the yeast activating properly in the gentle room-wide warmth. A pat of butter left on the table remained soft and spreadable. There were no drafts. To prove it to himself, Colin performed an experiment on the second night of the siege. He took a single tallow candle and placed it on the floor, directly on the iron grate. Then he lit it. The flame rose, a perfect, unwavering teardrop of light, reaching straight for the ceiling. It burned that way all night, a silent testament to the stillness of the air. He knew that in any other cabin on the flank, that same candle flame would have been a frantic, guttering dance, tormented by the unseen currents of cold air bleeding through the walls. Here, there was only a profound and peaceful calm. On the 7th day of the ice fog siege, Wutsadatsanki beiced, the world outside was a sculpture of ice. Aldous Pendergrast was making his rounds, a miserable duty that his role as claim recorder required. He had to deliver a delinquency notice to a miner who lived just beyond the Trevithick claim. The official procedure required a witness point, meaning he had to be seen by a neighbor while posting the notice. Colin's cabin was the only choice. He rode his horse slowly, the animal's breath freezing instantly on its muzzle. Pendergrast's own beard was a solid mass of ice. He dismounted stiffly, his gloved hands clumsy with cold. He pulled the notice and a hammer and nail from his saddlebag. As he approached Colin's door, he fumbled with the items, his fingers numb and useless. His heavy, leather-bound claim ledger, tucked under his arm, slipped. It slid down his coat, hit the porch boards with a dull thud, and skittered directly into the center of the room, vanishing through the dark metal grate in the floor. "Damnation," Pendergrast muttered, the word a frozen puff of air. The ledger contained all the official records for the past month. The cabin door opened. Colin Trevithick stood there, wearing only a wool shirt against the cold. Behind him, Pendergrast could see the warm, lamp-lit interior. There was no blast of heat, no cloud of smoke, just a sense of profound stillness. "Mr. Pendergrast, you look frozen through." "My ledger," Pendergrast said, pointing with a gloved hand. "It fell through your drain." Colin nodded. "It happens." He walked to the center of the room, bent down, and with two hands lifted the heavy iron grate and set it aside, revealing the dark, 8-foot circle of the shaft. "It will be on the ledge just below. I can get it for you." "No, I'll get it," Pendergrast said, stepping inside. He was immediately struck by the absence of cold. The air wasn't hot, like in a cabin with a roaring fire. It was just not cold. He walked to the opening and knelt down, peering into the darkness. He expected a blast of frigid, damp air to hit him in the face, the foul breath of a grave, smelling of wet rock and decay. That was the universal experience of every mine opening in winter. Instead, something utterly confounding happened. A slow, steady, and entirely neutral column of air rose to meet his face. It was not warm, not cold. It carried no scent of rot or mildew. It was simply calm. It felt like the air of a cool spring cellar. It gently thawed the ice in his mustache and brought a strange, prickling life back to the frozen skin of his cheeks. He reached his arm down into the shaft. The air enveloped his hand, a tangible, rising presence. He could see his ledger resting on a rockfall about 6 feet down. He stretched, retrieved it, and brought it back up. His bare hand and wrist bathed in this impossible, gentle current. He stood up, holding the ledger, and stared at Colin Trevithick. The claim recorder, a man of rules and hard-won frontier knowledge, felt the foundations of his certainty crack. He looked from the placid, unwavering flame of the lamp on the table to the dark opening in the floor, and he finally understood. "My God, man," Pendergrast whispered, his voice full of awe. "You haven't built a floor. You've built a shoreline between two climates." Pendergrast became the idea's first and most fervent missionary. A man of official standing, his conversion carried weight. He described what he had felt, that impossible rising air, to anyone who would listen. But the true vector for the idea's spread was quieter and more methodical. Pendergrast, in his official capacity, often spoke with an assayer's clerk in Virginia City named Elias Vance. Vance was a young man with a technical mind, tasked by a mine superintendent to compile a short pamphlet on best practices for shaft ventilation, to reduce the risks of foul air and collapse. Intrigued by Pendergrast's passionate description, Vance rode up to the Trevithick claim himself. He spent 2 hours with Colin, taking precise measurements, sketching the layout, and listening to the quiet Cornishman explain the principles of a convection circuit. Vance saw it not as a residential heating system, but as a brilliant macro application of mine ventilation. He understood the physics immediately. In his pamphlet titled Notes on the Management of Air Courses in Vertical Shafts, he included a new section. It featured a detailed cross-section diagram of Colin's cabin, which he labeled the Trevithick Geothermal Register. He described how any deep, single-opening shaft could act as a thermal regulator, and he explained the function of the central grate and the perimeter floor gaps. The pamphlet was distributed to mine foremen and shaft crews all over the Comstock lode. Most ignored the section on the strange cabin, but a few, who had families living on claims with old prospect holes, saw not just a curiosity, but a solution. By the following autumn, 3 families had adapted the design. They didn't build new cabins. They simply retrofitted their existing floors, cutting a central opening and prying up every 4th or 5th board to create gaps. The results were immediate and dramatic. They reported cutting their winter fuel consumption by more than 60%. The idea began to spread, not as a radical new invention, but as a piece of practical, hard-won mining wisdom passed from one crew to the next. What Colin Trevithick had built on that windy flank was more than just a warm home. With the tools of a 19th-century carpenter and the knowledge of a Cornish miner, he had engineered a rudimentary, passive geothermal heat exchanger. He had tapped into the immense thermal stability of the planet, a concept that would not be fully formalized by building science for another 100 years. Modern geothermal systems use pumps and compressors to circulate fluid through underground pipes, actively harvesting the Earth's heat. Colin's system did the same thing with zero energy input, using the air itself as the transfer medium. His insulated double walls anticipated the principles of the building envelope, a core concept in modern energy-efficient construction that treats a house as a complete system, not just a collection of parts. The constant, gentle air exchange provided by his convection loop also ensured a supply of fresh, pre-warmed air, preventing the buildup of stale, oxygen-depleted air that plagued tightly sealed conventional cabins with roaring fires. He had, without the language of modern science, created a healthy, breathable, and profoundly efficient living machine. The quiet man on the Comstock flank was a pioneer of sustainable design, a century ahead of his time. The genius of Colin Trevithick was not in opposition, but in observation. The other settlers saw the Nevada winter as an enemy to be fought, a force to be bludgeoned into submission with roaring fires and thick walls. They waged a constant, exhausting war against the cold, a war they could never truly win, only survive. Their relationship with the landscape was one of conflict. Colin saw it differently. His life in the mines had taught him that you do not fight the earth. You learn its habits and redirect its immense, patient forces to your own ends. He saw the cold not as an enemy, but as one half of a powerful engine. The other half was the deep, abiding warmth of the mountain itself. His solution was one of elegance and partnership. He didn't try to create warmth from scratch, burning through the landscape's scarce resources. He simply opened a door and invited in the warmth that was already there, a warmth the mountain had held in its stony heart, since long before the first pick was ever struck into its hide. He didn't feed the cold a fire. He asked the mountain for warmth it had kept undisturbed. If you enjoyed this story of frontier ingenuity, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales of historical problem solving. We believe the past holds lessons that are more relevant today than ever. Let us know in the comments what modern technology you think was anticipated by a much older, simpler invention. Thanks for watching. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by historical building practices and scientific principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative invention. While the techniques are based on real-world physics, any application of similar methods today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and engineering best practices. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.